Now, Russian President Vladimir Putin has warned NATO countries they risk nuclear war if they send troops to Ukraine. He made the threat as he delivered his annual State of the Nation address ahead of an election in which he's the only serious candidate. Now, Putin went on to say he'd be stationing more soldiers in Russia's west, close to new NATO members, Finland and Sweden.
Vladimir Putin has given his annual State of the Union address just 2 weeks before the presidential election. Despite facing no meaningful opposition, he announced social reforms and a €10 billion overhaul of Russia's healthcare system. But the war in Ukraine still dominates. Earlier this week, the French President Emmanuel Macron refused to rule out the West sending troops to Ukraine, prompting a stark warning from Putin.
They should eventually understand that we also have weapons, and they know it. I just said it now myself, weapons that can hit targets on their territory. Everything that the West is coming up with now, what they threaten the world with, it can result in a conflict with the use of nuclear weapons, and therefore the destruction of civilization.
Some other NATO countries, including Lithuania, have backed the French position. But the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, has rejected any idea of direct NATO involvement in the war in Ukraine.
NATO is not and will not be party to the war. That remains the case. We do not want Russia's war against Ukraine to become a war between Russia and NATO. We agree on this with all our allies. This also means no German participation in the war.
And with no sign of any let-up in the war, and Putin heading for a quarter of a century in power, relations between Russia and the West are likely to remain tense for the foreseeable future.
Let's go to DW's Eastern Europe editor Roman Goncharenko for more. Roman, Putin here threatening the West that deeper involvement could mean a global nuclear war. How seriously should we take these very serious claims? Or do you think this is just Putin trying to rally his domestic audience?
Well, I think we should take everything that comes from Vladimir Putin seriously, especially when it comes to threats like today. On the other hand, there is no immediate threat of a nuclear conflict between Russia and NATO. So what he was saying is just be careful what you do. But he's been saying this before. Other Russian politicians, like the former President Medvedev, has been threatening that nearly just every couple of weeks. Why it's important? It's important because this signal came from Macron, this suggestion. This is something new. Russia probably didn't expect it. But I think most important is signaling or threatening the West with a nuclear war. The Russian president, the Russian authorities are trying to stop the West from helping Ukraine. And this intimidation, it works to a certain extent because there are certain types of weapons like long-range missiles that the West is not ready to deliver.
So it sounds like you think this does indeed raise the stakes for the West as it considers how much support to continue providing Ukraine.
Well, it's really hard to tell if it really raises the stakes. I'm skeptical about it because it's not really new what he has been saying. What is new is the suggestion of Macron, but this is President Macron. But this is a theoretical question at the moment. Nobody is talking about sending troops to Ukraine in the near future. So when the conditions remain as they are in this war, there will be probably no need for the Western countries to do that. But they might change if Ukraine starts losing. Anyway, the stakes are relatively high as well at this moment anyway, because Russia is waging a conventional war with an open end and is not going to stop. And this was the signal by President Putin.
So if no one is talking about this seriously at this point, why did we then hear German Chancellor Olaf Scholz there go out of his way to make it very clear that no German troops would participate in fighting in Ukraine?
Well, the obvious reason is because President Macron brought it up. So Scholz had to respond. There is an unofficial rivalry between Germany and France in Europe as two major economic and military powers. So Scholz had to respond, but he's not the only one. Just remember, President Biden of the United States also has ruled out several times sending troops to Ukraine. So why Scholz and Biden do this, and other European politicians as well? Because this is dangerous, and Chancellor Scholz has said it as well many times. So nobody wants a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO. So everybody is very, very careful. But that's why. And some experts also believe that Scholz's remarks might have something to do with the coming elections in Germany and in Europe, to the European Parliament and some regional elections in Germany. And this idea of Scholz, no troops, this of course resonates with parts of German public, not only in Germany, but in other parts of Europe and the world. So nobody wants this war to escalate. And some experts believe that this could be an attempt by Scholz also to maybe use it in the future election campaign, because his party is not doing well in the polls.
Well, thank you so much for providing that context for us. That is our Eastern Europe editor, Roman Goncharenko.
Now we're going to go back to our top story again now. President Putin's annual State of the Nation speech and his hint that nuclear weapons could be used if NATO countries send troops to Ukraine. And we can get more on that from Jade McGlynn. She's an expert on Russian politics and foreign policy with the Department of War Studies at King's College London. Welcome, Jade. Now, today's speech was possibly Vladimir Putin's strongest warning yet about the risk of nuclear conflict. It's not a new threat, is it? So I wanted to ask you, which part of his address did you take most note of?
I think the part of the address that I took most note of was his confidence bordering on what I hope would be hubris, but which I'm afraid I dread is probably quite well placed. His confidence in dismissing the US, not just the US, but any efforts at diplomacy as just political posturing. His insistence that Russia is fighting somehow an anti-colonial war against the West, and just his general confidence about the battlefield, which of course is slightly rose-tinted given he's not mentioning the enormous losses in Avdiivka. But as somebody who just recently got back from Donbass, I'm currently in Kyiv, unfortunately the situation at the front is very bad for those of us who would like to see Ukraine win, and a lot of his confidence, I'm afraid, actually didn't feel quite as misplaced as I would hope it would.
Putin said that Russia's strategic nuclear forces are in a state of full readiness, and he mentioned new generation hypersonic weapons. So you've mentioned his self-confidence. To what extent does all of this take things to the next level of threat?
I don't think it does take it to the next level of threat. I think we're still on the level of, rhetorical braggadocio, if you will. And we get a lot of that from Russia. This is, as you referred to in your first question, this is nobody's first rodeo in terms of Russia's nuclear threats. If Russia were to put its nuclear weapons into an actual state of readiness for use, there are many, many signals that would come, and, many Western governments would be aware of that. So we have to be careful to separate what Putin says, which is obviously aimed at both a domestic audience, shoring up support for a war that has gone on, 2 years longer than originally planned, and of course frightening the West, and in particular sending a message to those de-escalationists, in particular in Washington, D.C., who understandably have a very great fear of nuclear escalation. He's playing on those fears.
Putin dismissed Washington's recent claims that Russia was considering putting nuclear weapons into space. He said that they were unsubstantiated allegations. He described them as ravings. How would you assess that?
I'm not really in a position to assess the Russia's capacity in space, but I do find it rather cheeky of him to dismiss anybody after a 31-minute answer on Yaroslav the Wise and the origins of Kievan Rus. I find it quite cheeky of him to dismiss anything anybody else would say as ravings.
All right. Well, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you so much for that analysis. Jade McGlynn from King's College London. Thanks for speaking to us.